For 3 years, I smiled politely through endless dinner parties while my husband David dismissed my simple homemaker life to impress his executive friends. The crystal glasses in their hands, purchased with my money. The luxury penthouse. They admired, paid for with my investments. The company they bragged about climbing the ranks in, wholly owned by me through a network of holding companies they never bothered to research. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The irony was delicious, but patience is sweeter than immediate satisfaction. I wasn't just waiting for the perfect moment. I was documenting every instance of corporate misconduct, every example of toxic leadership, and every financial irregularity they carelessly discussed in my home. Their arrogance made them blind. Their dismissal of a mere housewife made them vulnerable. They never saw me coming until it was too late. For 3 years, I smiled politely through endless dinner parties, while my husband David dismissed my simple homemaker life to impress his executive friends. The crystal glasses in their hands, purchased with my money. The luxury penthouse they admired, paid for with my investments. The company they bragged about climbing the ranks in, wholly owned by me through a network of holding companies they never bothered to research. Close-up of protagonist's face, showing a knowing smile. The irony was delicious, but patience is sweeter than immediate satisfaction. I wasn't just waiting for the perfect moment. I was documenting every instance of corporate misconduct, every example of toxic leadership, and every financial irregularity they carelessly discussed in my home. Their arrogance made them blind. Their dismissal of a mere housewife made them vulnerable. They never saw me coming until it was too late. Part 1. Powerful Opening Contrast. For 3 years, I smiled politely through endless dinner parties, while my husband David dismissed my simple homemaker life to impress his executive friends. The crystal glasses in their hands, purchased with my money. The luxury penthouse they admired, paid for with my investments. The company they bragged about climbing the ranks in, wholly owned by me through a network of holding companies they never bothered to research. "Rebecca, sweetheart, can you bring us more of that excellent scotch?" David called out, not bothering to look in my direction. "While my wife handles that, let me tell you about the acquisition we're finalizing next week." I moved quietly toward our bar cart, maintaining the pleasant, slightly vacant smile I'd perfected over years of being underestimated. The amber liquid caught the light as I poured it into crystal tumblers worth more than most people's monthly salary. The executives from Meridian Global barely acknowledged me as I refilled their glasses with the 30-year-old scotch I'd purchased from a private collector in Edinburgh last year. "Must be nice, David, having someone take care of everything at home, so you can focus on the real work," said Victor, the CFO, winking at me like I was a child who should be flattered by the attention. "Absolutely essential," David agreed, loosening his Italian silk tie, a birthday gift from me. "Rebecca's happy with her little household projects and social lunches. Not everyone's cut out for the corporate battlefield." The other men nodded, sagely, as if my husband had dispensed profound wisdom rather than casual disrespect. I served them with practiced grace, invisible yet essential, exactly as I'd planned. What they couldn't see was the Harvard MBA hanging in my private study, hidden behind a false wall that David had never discovered in our 3 years of marriage. Or the secure laptop in my personal safe that connected me to the executive dashboard of Meridian Global's parent company, Artemis International. They certainly couldn't see that every decision they congratulated themselves for had been quietly guided by strategic directives from major shareholders, shell companies that all traced back to me. I'd built Artemis International from nothing, 15 years ago, before I'd ever met David. Back then, I operated openly as R.E. Winters, the driven CEO making headlines for innovative corporate structures and aggressive expansion. But after 2 high-profile relationships ended with men who were more interested in my wealth than me, I decided to conduct an experiment with my next relationship. When I met David at a charity gala in Vienna, I introduced myself simply as Rebecca, an art consultant transitioning to homemaking. I drove a modest car, wore understated jewelry, and spoke little of my past. David, then a promising middle manager, seemed refreshingly interested in me rather than my apparent station in life. The first year was wonderful. He was attentive, kind, and supportive. "Not everyone needs a high-powered career to be fulfilled," he'd say, seeming to accept me completely. We married in a small ceremony, and I suggested he move into what he thought was my modest inheritance, a penthouse apartment I'd owned for years. The changes were subtle at first, a dismissive comment here, an eye roll there when I expressed an opinion on economics or politics. But as he rose through the ranks, at Meridian Global, promotions invisibly assisted by the parent company he never thought to research, his true character emerged. "I hear the board is impressed with your team's performance this quarter," I mentioned casually, placing a tray of appetizers on the table prepared by the chef I'd hired, though David believed I'd made them myself. David looked momentarily surprised. That I'd spoken about business, then laughed. "Office gossip from your neighbor again? Stick to planning the garden party, honey. Leave the business discussions to us." More condescending laughter rippled around the table. I noticed Andrew from marketing nearly spill his drink in his haste to join the merriment. Robert from operations actually slapped his knee. The spectacle of these men, all of whom would be horrified to learn they were mocking the woman who ultimately signed their paychecks, was both pitiful and infuriating. "Did you hear about the Thompson project?" asked Stefan, VP of International Development. "Rebecca probably thinks that's a new housing community." Fresh laughter. I nodded apologetically and retreated to the kitchen, memorizing each slight, each name, each dismissive glance. The Thompson project was actually my initiative, a complex restructuring of our Asian operations that would save the company millions while improving working conditions in our factories. David had presented it as his own brainchild. In the kitchen's Taobi privacy, I checked my secure phone. A message from Elena, my most trusted executive, and one of the few who knew my true identity, had just arrived. Board documents prepared as requested. Operation Clean House ready whenever you give the word. All evidence of financial improprieties cataloged and verified by legal. I allowed myself a small, genuine smile as I arranged chocolate truffles on a silver platter. 3 years of meticulous documentation was about to pay off. 3 years of recording every misogynistic comment, every ethical breach casually mentioned over drinks, every instance of credit stolen from female colleagues. 3 years of watching David transform from a seemingly decent man to an entitled tyrant who believed his success was entirely self-made. Tomorrow, while David was nursing his hangover and preparing for what he thought would be a routine board meeting, I would be arriving early at Meridian Global headquarters, not as Rebecca the housewife, but as R.E. Winters, the reclusive founder and majority shareholder of Artemis International. Through the kitchen doorway, I could hear them now, discussing their female colleagues in terms that would violate any reasonable HR policy. David was leading the charge, secure in the belief that his wife would never understand the nuances of corporate politics enough to judge him. The contrast between who they thought I was and who I actually was couldn't have been more stark. And that gap was about to close in the most satisfying way possible, not just for my own vindication, but for every woman they'd ever underestimated, dismissed, or talked over. I straightened my shoulders, picked up the tray of truffles, and walked back into the dining room with the same pleasant, vacant smile they had come to expect. Just one more evening of their arrogance. Just one more night of being invisible. Tomorrow, I would be the only thing they could see. I woke before dawn, careful not to disturb David, who lay sprawled across his side of our king-sized bed, still, reeking of expensive scotch and entitlement. The digital clock read 4:30 a.m., 3 hours before he typically stumbled to the shower on workdays. Perfect timing. In the walk-in closet that David rarely entered, "Fashion is your department, honey," I pressed my palm against a seemingly ordinary section of wall. A soft click, and a hidden panel slid open, revealing a separate closet space he'd never discovered. Inside hung tailored power suits, designer shoes, and accessories I wore in my other life, the life of R.E. Winters, corporate strategist, and business owner. I selected a charcoal Armani suit with subtle pinstripes, paired with crimson-soled Louboutins that added 3 inches to my height. The diamond earrings and platinum watch weren't for show. They were symbols of authority. In the world I'd built, signals that would be immediately recognized by those who understood true power. As I dressed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. The transformation wasn't just in the clothing. My posture straightened, my chin lifted, my eyes sharpened with focus and determination. The pleasant, slightly vacant expression I wore as David's wife melted away, replaced by the calculating gaze of a woman who controlled billions in assets and thousands of careers. This was the real me, the person I'd hidden away for 3 long years. I moved to my private study, accessed through a door disguised as a linen closet. David had never shown the slightest interest in household organization, making it the perfect cover. Inside was the command center of my actual life, multiple monitors displaying real-time data from Artemis International operations worldwide, secure servers containing the evidence I'd been gathering, and the Harvard MBA diploma that David would have been shocked to discover belonged to his simple wife. My phone buzzed with a message from Elena. Car waiting at alternate location. Board members notified of special meeting. Security protocols in place. Elena had been with me from the beginning, one of the few people who knew both sides of my life. As my chief of operations at Artemis, she had implemented countless directives I'd developed during quiet afternoons when David thought I was attending cooking classes or charity luncheons. Her loyalty was absolute, her competence unquestionable, and her disgust for men like David and his colleagues matched my own. I opened my laptop and reviewed the files one last time. Hundreds of documented instances of misconduct by David and his executive team. Financial improprieties barely concealed in creative accounting. Credit stolen from female employees, many of whom had left the company. Evidence of insider trading disguised as lucky hunches. Hostile work environment testimonies from current and former staff. Email threads revealing discriminatory hiring practices. Recordings from my own home of strategic information being shared with competitors. Any one of these files could damage their careers. Together, they formed an irrefutable case for immediate termination. The board had already reviewed summaries of my findings, though they didn't yet know the source. Today, that would change. I glanced at the corner of my screen. 5:15 a.m. Time. To move. Before leaving, I stepped into the kitchen and prepared David's favorite hangover remedy, a special blend of electrolytes, pain relievers, and vitamins I'd created during our marriage. Old habits die hard, I supposed, though this would be the last kindness I extended to him. I left it on his nightstand with a note in my Rebecca handwriting. Early yoga class, then shopping. Board meeting at 10, don't forget. Love, R. The R was my small hint, my first whisper of revelation. By the time he noticed the ambiguity, it would be too late. I slipped through a private exit in our building, another feature David knew nothing about, and found the car Elena had arranged. The driver, part of my trusted security team, nodded. Respectfully. Good morning, Ms. Winters. Good morning, Jackson. Headquarters, please. As we drove through the awakening city, I gazed out at the skyline, noting the Artemis International logo gleaming from the top of our flagship building. The corporate empire I'd built from nothing after escaping an impoverished childhood in rural Michigan. My father had been a factory worker who lost everything when the plant closed. My mother, a cleaner who worked herself to illness trying to keep us afloat. Their struggles had taught me 2 critical lessons. Financial independence was non-negotiable, and people would underestimate you if you let them. I had turned the latter into an advantage, using others' assumptions to observe them when their guards were down. The car pulled into the private underground entrance of Artemis Tower. Elena was waiting, tablet in hand, her usual efficient self. The board members are all confirmed for 8:30. David and his team have their regular 10 a.m. meeting. Security has been briefed. Legal is standing by. She handed me a small portfolio. These just need your final signature. Inside were the termination papers for David and his executive team, each document detailing specific violations and referencing evidence files. I signed them with the practiced stroke of R.E. Winters, so different from the flowing script of, "Rebecca, have the Meridian Global employees been notified of the special meeting?" "Just the department heads, as you requested. They've been told it's a standard quarterly review. No one suspects anything." I nodded, satisfied. "And the announcement? To the company?" "Drafted and ready to send the moment the board meeting concludes." We rode the private elevator to the executive floor, a space David had visited countless times without ever knowing who really controlled it. The CEO's office, which he believed belonged to a reclusive executive who communicated primarily through video calls, was actually mine. For 3 years, I had conducted business from this office when David was traveling, sometimes just hours after he'd left the building. I settled behind the vast mahogany desk and opened the folder containing my presentation for the board. A knock at the door signaled Elena's return. "The board will be here in 20 minutes. Would you like to review anything else before they arrive?" I smiled. A genuine smile, not the pleasant mask I wore for David. "No. After 3 years of preparation, I'm more than ready." Elena paused, her professional demeanor slipping for just a moment. "May I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Was any part of your relationship with David real? In the beginning, perhaps?" The question deserved careful consideration. I thought back to our early days, before his promotion, before the money and status had revealed his true character. "I believed it was," I finally answered. "I wanted to find someone who valued me, not my wealth or position. The experiment wasn't meant to be cruel. It was meant to be revealing. And reveal it did." I straightened the papers on my desk. "Just not in the way I'd hoped." Elena nodded, understanding in her eyes. She had seen the evolution of my marriage, had witnessed my initial hope fade into disappointment and then harden into resolve. "The car service has been instructed to bring David directly to the main boardroom when he arrives for his 10 meeting," she confirmed. "Perfect." I checked my watch, the elegant Patek Philippe that had been locked away in my secret closet for 3 years. It's time to reintroduce R.E. Winters to the world. As Elena left to escort the board members to the conference room, I stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, looking out at the city below. Somewhere out there, David was probably just waking up, reaching for the remedy I'd left him, completely unaware that his world was about to implode. The thought brought neither joy nor sadness, only the calm certainty that justice delayed was not always justice denied. Sometimes it was simply justice perfected. The board members filed into the executive conference room precisely at 8:30 a.m. 12 men and women representing major stakeholders in Artemis International, all accustomed to quarterly video conferences, with the reclusive R.E. Winters but never expecting to meet in person. The confusion on their faces was evident as they took their seats around the polished conference table, exchanging puzzled glances. I watched their arrival through the one-way glass of my adjoining office. Elena entered first, setting up the presentation, materials with characteristic efficiency. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for accommodating this special meeting on short notice," she began. "As indicated in your briefing materials, we have an urgent corporate governance matter to address. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce someone." She turned toward the private entrance door. "Please welcome R.E. Winters, founder and majority shareholder of Artemis International." I stepped into the room, and 12 pairs of eyes widened in simultaneous shock. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft click of my heels against the marble floor as I took my position at the head of the table. "Good morning," I said, my voice carrying the authority that had built a multinational corporation. "I appreciate your discretion regarding this unscheduled meeting. Today marks the end of a 3-year corporate integrity investigation and the beginning of a significant restructuring." Walter Kingsley, our longest-serving board member, found his voice first. "Ms. Winters, this is unexpected. We were under the impression that you operated exclusively from your European offices." "A necessary fiction, Mr. Kingsley," I replied, nodding to Elena, who distributed sealed folders to each board member. "For reasons that will become clear shortly, I've been conducting an internal investigation from within Meridian Global itself. What you're receiving is a summary of my findings." As they opened their folders, I projected a series of photographs onto the main screen. Each showed David and his executive team at various functions: charity galas, corporate retreats, and several from dinner parties at my own home. In most images, I was visible in the background, serving drinks or engaged in conversation with other spouses. "For those who don't recognize her," said Bernard Taylor, squinting at the images. "Who is the woman in these photographs?" "That would be me, Mr. Taylor," I replied calmly. "For the past 3 years, I have been living as Rebecca Morrison, wife of David Morrison, Executive Vice President of Operations at Meridian Global." The stunned silence returned, broken by scattered whispers and shocked expressions. "Your husband?" Charlotte Reeves, our newest board member, asked incredulously. "Correct, though not for much longer." I changed the display to a series of financial charts. "Before we address that personal matter, let's focus on the business concerns that necessitated this deception." For the next 30 minutes, I methodically outlined the evidence I'd gathered. Financial irregularities within Meridian Global, discriminatory practices instituted by David's executive team, intellectual property theft from female employees, and instances of insider trading that could trigger SEC investigations. 3 years ago, I explained, anonymous reports of these practices reached me through our ethics hotline. Rather than delegate the investigation, I decided to observe firsthand. What began as a corporate governance concern quickly revealed a systemic cultural problem within our most profitable subsidiary. I clicked to the next slide, a recording from one of David's drunken dinner parties 6 months ago. "Play the Jensen acquisition audio, please, Elena." David's voice filled the room. "The best part about the Jensen deal? The old man never realized we'd been feeding his vice president information for months. By the time we acquired them, we'd already replicated their proprietary process. Saved us millions in R&D. Victor's voice followed. "Should we be discussing this outside the office, David?" "Relax," David laughed. "It's just Rebecca. She thinks Jensen is a type of cheese." The recording ended, and I met the stunned gaze of each board member in turn. "This represents a small sample of the corporate espionage and unethical practices I've documented," I said. "But the cultural issues run deeper." The next recording began. Another dinner party, just 2 weeks ago. David's voice again, slightly slurred with alcohol. "You know why the Davis proposal is stalling? She's insisting on running point. I told Matthews to reassign it. We can't have a woman leading the Singapore negotiations. They'll eat her alive and we'll lose the contract." Victor again. "Isn't Davis your top performer?" "Technically, yes," David admitted. "But some roles require a man's touch. She can do the background work and Johnson can present. That's just how business works." I stopped the recording and surveyed the board. Several members looked physically uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact. "As you can see," I continued, "the leadership issues extend beyond financial improprieties to creating a hostile work environment that violates not only our corporate values, but potentially employment law. The complete evidence files are available for your review, including testimony from current and former employees." Charlotte Reeves leaned forward. You've been living as this man's wife for 3 years to gather evidence? That was not my original intention, I clarified. David and I met at a charity function. I was conducting a personal experiment in authenticity, seeing how people would treat me without the influence of my position. Our relationship seemed genuine initially. The marriage was real, at least on my part. I changed slides again, showing a chart of Meridian Global's declining employee retention rates, particularly among women and minorities. As David rose through the ranks, aided by invisible support from this board following my private recommendations, his behavior changed. The man I married disappeared, revealing someone else entirely. By that point, I was already tracking concerning patterns in Meridian's operations. The personal and professional investigations merged. Walter Kingsley cleared his throat. These allegations are serious, Ms. Winters. What actions are you proposing? Elena distributed a second set of documents. Immediate termination of David Morrison and his executive team, effective today. Full cooperation with any regulatory investigations their actions may have triggered. And a comprehensive restructuring of Meridian Global's leadership and culture. Bernard E. Taylor frowned, tapping his pen against the table. The financial implications of removing the entire executive team simultaneously have been thoroughly analyzed, I interrupted, signaling Elena who projected the relevant financial models. We've identified internal candidates to assume interim leadership roles, and I'll personally oversee the transition. The short-term disruption is preferable to the long-term risks of allowing these practices to continue. For the next 20 minutes, the board asked pointed questions about the evidence, the proposed restructuring, and the potential fallout. I answered each with precision, backed by 3 years of meticulous planning. Finally, Walter Kingsley called for a vote. Those in favor of adopting Ms. Winters' recommendations for immediate termination and restructuring? 12 hands raised without hesitation. The motion carries unanimously, he declared. What's our next step? I checked my watch. 9:45 a.m. David and his team will be arriving for their regular 10 a.m. meeting in approximately 15 minutes. With your approval, I'd like to personally inform them of the board's decision. Charlotte Reeves raised an eyebrow. You want to be present when your husband discovers who you really are? I believe I've earned that right, Ms. Reeves, I replied, my voice steady. Not for personal satisfaction, but to ensure they understand the gravity of their actions and the thoroughness of our response. The board members exchanged glances before Walter nodded. We'll remain for the termination meeting. I think we all want to witness the resolution of this extraordinary situation. As the board members took a brief recess before the next meeting, Elena approached with an update. Security confirms David's car just entered the parking garage. The others are already in the building. Meeting room B has been prepared as you requested. Meeting room B, the room with the best acoustic recording capabilities and the most imposing atmosphere, with its sweeping views of the city below. I had chosen it deliberately. The psychological advantage of elevation and the subtle reinforcement of power dynamics weren't lost on someone who had built a business empire from nothing. Thank you, Elena. Is everything else in place? Yes. Security has temporary badges ready for David and his team to exit the building. Their office access has been revoked, and IT has secured their accounts. Personal items will be packed and delivered to their homes by our service. As instructed, we've flagged certain documents on David's laptop that support your evidence file. I nodded, satisfied with the preparations. And the announcement to the company? Ready to send the moment the termination meeting concludes. Department heads have been briefed to expect significant announcements and are standing by to reassure their teams. I took a moment to center myself, to transition fully from Rebecca Morrison to R.E. Winters. For 3 years, I had compartmentalized these identities, moving between them as necessary. Today would be the last time such navigation was required. Through the glass wall, I could see board members returning to their seats, their expressions a mixture of anticipation and discomfort. This wasn't a typical day in corporate governance. "They're approaching the executive floor," Elena reported, checking her tablet. "Security has directed them to meeting room B as requested. They believe they're attending their regular strategy meeting." I straightened my suit jacket and checked my reflection in the glass. There was no trace of Rebecca in my appearance now. The subtle body language, the softened expression, the carefully cultivated air of pleasant domesticity were gone. In their place stood the woman who had built Artemis International through strategic brilliance and unwavering determination. "It's time," I said, more to myself than to Elena. As we walked toward meeting room B, I reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The young girl from rural Michigan who had put herself through college while working 2 jobs. The MBA student who faced dismissive professors and handsy classmates with equal resolve. The entrepreneur who built a business empire while being told repeatedly that her ambitions were unrealistic. And finally, the woman who had married a man she thought was different, only to discover he was perhaps the most predictable of all. The conference room door loomed ahead. On the other side waited David and his executive team, still blissfully unaware that their world was about to change irrevocably, still confident in their positions, their power, their assumptions about the natural order of things. I felt no joy at the prospect of their downfall, no anticipation of sweet revenge, only the calm certainty that actions have consequences. And today, those consequences had finally arrived. I nodded to Elena, who opened the door. Time to rewrite the narrative. Elena opened the door to meeting room B, and I stepped into the familiar cacophony of David's pre-meeting routine. The 5 men were arranged around the conference table, laptops open, trading the usual mix of business jargon and barely disguised boasting. Their conversation halted abruptly as they registered the unexpected presence of the board members filing in behind me. David recovered first, rising from his chair with the practiced charm he reserved for those he perceived as useful. "Mr. Kingsley, board members, this is an unexpected pleasure. We weren't aware you'd be joining our strategy session today." His eyes slid past me without recognition, categorizing me as someone's assistant perhaps, or a new board member he hadn't been briefed on. I had counted on this momentary blindness, the way powerful men often looked through women they didn't immediately recognize as important. Walter Kingsley didn't return David's smile. "This isn't your regular strategy meeting, Mr. Morrison. Please, everyone remain seated." Confusion flashed across 5 faces as the board members arranged themselves along the periphery of the room. Elena took a position by the door, tablet in hand, her expression professionally neutral. David's gaze darted between Walter and the other board members, his instincts finally registering danger. Is something wrong? Our quarterly numbers are tracking above projections and the Singapore deal is... This meeting isn't about performance metrics, I interrupted, stepping forward. It's about corporate governance and ethical standards. At the sound of my voice, David's attention snapped fully to me for the first time. I watched the progression of emotions across his face: confusion, dawning recognition, disbelief, and, finally, alarm. "Rebecca?" he said, his voice rising in pitch. "What are you doing here? How did you get into this meeting?" Victor leaned toward him, whispering loud enough for everyone to hear. "Your wife? What the hell, David?" I moved to the head of the table, the position David usually occupied during these meetings. I believe some introductions are in order. Gentlemen, my name is R.E. Winters. I am the founder and majority shareholder of Artemis International Parent, company of Meridian Global. The silence that followed was absolute. David's face drained of color. Stefan's coffee cup froze halfway to his mouth. Andrew actually laughed nervously, as if waiting for the punchline. "That's not... You can't be..." David sputtered. "R.E. Winters is..." a reclusive business genius who communicates primarily through video conferences and proxies, I finished for him. Yes, that was a necessary fiction, one that allowed me to observe Meridian Global's operations from a unique vantage point for the past 3 years. Victor recovered enough to attempt damage control. There must be some confusion. Rebecca is David's wife. She's a homemaker. Is she? Walter Kingsley interjected, his tone frosty. The board has just reviewed extensive evidence suggesting otherwise. I nodded to Elena, who activated the room's display screen. A series of images appeared. Official photographs of me from business publications, university records, the original, incorporation documents for Artemis International bearing my signature, and finally, a split screen of Rebecca Morrison and Ari Winters, 2 versions of the same woman. For the past 3 years, I explained, I have lived a dual existence. At home, as Rebecca Morrison, wife of David. In business, as Ari Winters, the executive you've supposedly reported to all this time. Robert, always the quickest to panic, began gathering his materials. This is some kind of joke, or a test. Either way, I don't think— Sit down, Mr. Phillips, Charlotte Reeves commanded from her position against the wall. This is neither a joke nor a test. David stared at me, his shock giving way to something darker. You've been spying on me? On us? For what possible reason? Initially? Corporate due diligence, I replied, keeping my voice even. Anonymous ethics complaints reached my office 3 years ago regarding financial irregularities and discriminatory practices within Meridian Global's executive team. Rather than launch a conventional investigation that might be detected and circumvented, I chose a more thorough approach. My gaze moved methodically from one executive to the next. What I discovered exceeded my worst expectations: systematic discrimination against female employees, financial reporting manipulations, inappropriate relationships with competitors, and a corporate culture built on cronyism rather than merit. Stefan found his voice, always the strategist trying to find an angle. If you had concerns, there are proper channels, which you and your colleagues actively monitored and suppressed, I cut in. Elena, please play the Henderson recording. David's voice filled the room. Another complaint from Henderson in accounting? That makes 3 this quarter. Have HR bury it like the others. If she keeps making noise about the reporting discrepancies, find a performance issue. Create one if necessary. I stopped the recording. This approach to legitimate concerns made conventional investigation impossible. But it wasn't just professional misconduct that concerned me. With another nod to Elena, a new recording began. From our anniversary dinner just 4 months ago, David speaking to Victor while I was supposedly in the kitchen. The best decision I ever made was marrying someone with no head for business. Rebecca thinks our lifestyle comes from my brilliance at Meridian. Meanwhile, I renegotiated her inheritance portfolio last year without her really understanding what she was signing. The lake house is now in my name. If things ever go south, I'm well protected. The board members shifted uncomfortably, David's face contorted with rage and humiliation. You recorded private conversations in our home? I documented systematic misconduct in my home, I corrected him. The same home purchased entirely with my funds, where you and your colleagues regularly discussed corporate strategies, competitor, information, and your various methods of undermining female employees and manipulating financial reports. I opened the folder in front of me. Which brings us to the purpose of today's meeting. The board has reviewed the evidence and voted unanimously for immediate termination of all 5 of you, effective immediately. Andrew's face crumpled. Robert looked like he might be sick. Stefan's expression hardened into calculation. Victor stared at the table. But David looked at me with pure hatred. You can't do this, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. I'm your husband. An arrangement that will also be terminated, I replied evenly. The divorce papers have already been filed. The prenuptial agreement you insisted upon, designed to protect your assets from your gold-digging wife, ironically now protects my assets from you. The bitter irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. David had insisted on the prenup, convinced he was the valuable party in our relationship, never imagining he was signing away any claim to the actual fortune in our marriage. "You've been planning this all along," he accused, his voice rising. "Was any of it real? Was our marriage just some elaborate corporate sting operation?" The question deserved an honest answer, if only for my own peace of mind. Our relationship was real, David, at least initially. Something flickered in his eyes, pain perhaps, or just wounded pride. "I met you as Rebecca because I was tired of men pursuing me for my wealth and position. I wanted to know if someone could value me for myself. And for a while you did." I held his gaze steadily. "But power changed you. Or perhaps it just revealed you. The man who courted me would never have mocked just a housewife or dismissed women's contributions or manipulated financial records for personal gain." "This is absurd," Victor interjected, always David's faithful lieutenant. "You can't terminate an entire executive team without cause," Walter Kingsley supplied. "There are over 300 documented instances of cause, Mr. Harrington. Would you like me to enumerate them individually?" Elena stepped forward, distributing sealed envelopes to each executive. "These are your termination notices, detailing the specific violations and terms of separation. Security is waiting outside to escort you from the building. Your personal belongings will be delivered to your homes by end of day." The reality of their situation finally seemed to register. Stefan opened his envelope with trembling fingers. Robert looked like he might cry. Andrew stared blankly at his name on the sealed paper. David, however, made one last attempt to regain control. "This won't stand. I know things about this company that were carefully fed to you," I finished. "Information I specifically wanted you to have, filtered through channels I controlled. Nothing you know constitutes leverage, David. Your knowledge of Meridian's operations has been curated from the beginning." I closed my folder and stood. "This meeting is adjourned. Security will escort you to collect any personal items from your immediate workspace, after which you'll be expected to leave the premises." As if on cue, the door opened and 4 security officers entered. The finality of the moment seemed to crush whatever resistance remained. The executives gathered their belongings in stunned silence, all except David, who remained seated, staring at me with a mixture of fury and disbelief. 3 years, he said quietly. 3 years of lying, of manipulating, of pretending to be something you're not. And you have the audacity to claim moral high ground? I considered his words carefully before responding. 3 years of strategic patience had taught me the value of measured responses. I didn't create fabricated performance reviews to force out talented women, I said. I didn't steal credit from subordinates. I didn't manipulate financial reports or engage in insider trading. I simply observed and documented while maintaining a cover that allowed me to see clearly. The moral implications of our respective choices seem rather evident. David stood slowly, straightening his suit jacket. The Tom Ford I'd given him for his last birthday. This isn't over, Rebecca. Or whatever you're calling yourself now. It is over, David. It was over the moment you decided that your wife was too simple to understand business, too naive to recognize financial manipulation, too insignificant to respect. I met his gaze unflinchingly. The greatest advantage I had wasn't my resources or position. It was your absolute certainty that I was beneath your consideration. Security stepped forward, but David raised a hand. I know the way out. He gathered his laptop and phone, then paused at the door. For what it's worth, I did love you, the woman I thought you were. And I loved the man I thought you were, I replied softly. We were both disappointed. The door closed behind him and his colleagues, leaving me with the board members and Elena, For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of what had just transpired, the end of my 3-year mission, my marriage, and the careers of 5 executives, settled across the room. Charlotte Reeves was the first to break the silence. Well, that was the most extraordinary termination meeting I've ever witnessed. Walter Kingsley nodded solemnly. Ms. Winters, while I can't condone deception as a general corporate practice, the evidence you've gathered will protect Artemis International from significant potential liability. The board commends your thoroughness, if not your methodology. Noted, Mr. Kingsley, I replied. I trust you understand these were exceptional circumstances that required unconventional approaches. What happens now? Bernard Taylor asked. Ever practical. I turned to Elena. Please issue the company-wide announcement as prepared. Schedule department meetings for this afternoon to address questions and concerns. Activate the leadership transition plan we developed. As Elena left to execute these directives, I addressed the board once more. Today marks the beginning of Meridian Global's transformation. We have interim leadership ready to step in, and I'll personally oversee the restructuring for the next quarter. The company announcement will emphasize our renewed commitment to ethical leadership and inclusive practices, not the specific misconduct that necessitated these changes. The board members nodded in agreement, professional masks back in place, now that the drama had concluded. They filed out of the conference room, leaving me alone with the aftermath of 3 years of strategic patience finally bearing fruit. I moved to the window, looking out at the city below. Somewhere down there, David and his colleagues were experiencing the first moments of their new reality. Careers in shambles, reputations damaged, futures uncertain. I felt no joy in their downfall, only a quiet satisfaction that justice, however, delayed, had finally been served. My phone buzzed with a message from Elena. Announcement sent. Company-wide response generally positive. Meeting in 10 minutes with transition team? I typed a quick confirmation, then took one more moment for myself. Rebecca Morrison, the soft-spoken, accommodating wife who endured 1,000 small humiliations, was gone forever. In her place stood R.E. Winters, restored to her rightful position and ready to build something better from the ashes of necessary destruction. The patient spider had finally sprung her web. And now, the real work could begin. The emergency transition. Team meeting concluded efficiently. 15 years of building Artemis International had taught me the value of preparation. Our contingency plans for Meridian Global's leadership vacuum had been meticulously developed over the past 6 months. By noon, interim directors were in place, communications had been distributed, and the initial shockwaves were being professionally managed throughout the organization. I returned to my private office, the true CEO's office that had sat mostly unused during my time as Rebecca, and found Elena waiting with lunch and a comprehensive update. Security confirms all 5 executives have left the building, she reported, placing a salad on my desk. IT has completed the lockdown of their accounts and devices. David attempted to download several files before surrendering his laptop, but the security protocols prevented any transfers. As expected, I murmured, more to myself than to Elena. David's first instinct would be to gather ammunition, leverage, anything to regain some measure of control. And the penthouse? The security codes have been changed as instructed. Your personal items were moved to your downtown residence last night. The items you flagged as David's have been packed and will be delivered to his mother's address this afternoon. I nodded, picking at my salad without much appetite. The adrenaline of the morning was fading, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion I hadn't anticipated. 3 years of compartmentalized living were catching up to me at once. You should rest, Elena observed, her professional demeanor softening slightly. The company won't collapse if you take an afternoon off. Soon, I promised. First, I need to review the employee responses to the announcement. And I'd like to meet with Diana Davis before the day ends. Elena raised an eyebrow. The woman whose Singapore project David reassigned? The same. She's exactly the kind of talent Meridian has been systematically undermining. I want her to lead the Singapore initiative as originally planned. Elena made a note, then hesitated. There's one more thing. David has been trying to reach you. He's called your private line 17 times in the past hour. I wasn't surprised. The initial shock would have given way to anger, then calculated. Strategy. David was nothing if not persistent when he wanted something. I'll deal with him later, I said, turning to my computer. For now, let's focus on stabilizing the company. As Elena left, I found myself staring at the framed photograph on my desk. Me at 22, standing in front of the first Artemis International office, a converted warehouse space I'd secured with my last dollars after maxing out credit cards, and borrowing from anyone who would listen. The hungry determination in my eyes reminded me of how far I'd come, and why I'd fought so hard to protect what I'd built. The journey to that first office had been longer and harder than anyone knew. The full story was something I rarely shared, but today, with the walls between my dual identities finally demolished, the memories surfaced with surprising clarity. I'd grown up in Oak Ridge, a declining industrial town in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. My father worked at the paper mill that employed half the town, while my mother cleaned houses for the managers and executives who lived on the hill overlooking our neighborhood of modest bungalows. The social hierarchy was clearly visible from any point in Oak Ridge. Those who worked with their hands lived below. Those who worked with their minds lived above. By 15, I was helping my mother with her cleaning jobs, silently observing the dynamics in those hillside homes. The wives who treated my mother like furniture while she scrubbed their floors. The husbands who spoke about factory workers as if they were interchangeable parts in a machine. The casual cruelty of privilege that neither saw nor cared about its impact. One particular family, the Prestons, stood out in my memory. Mr. Preston was the mill's operations director, directly overseeing my father. Mrs. Preston employed my mother 3 times weekly to maintain their sprawling home. Their son, Jason, was in my grade at school, though we occupied entirely different social spheres. The week before my 16th birthday, Mrs. Preston hosted a garden party. My mother and I worked double time to prepare the house, polish the silver, and set up the elaborate outdoor arrangements. As guests began to arrive, I was instructed to help serve refreshments, an unexpected addition to our usual cleaning duties, but one my mother accepted without complaint. I moved through the party with a tray of champagne flutes, invisible to the attendees except when they needed a drink. It was during this forced invisibility that I overheard Mr. Preston discussing the mill's future with several board members. "The overseas expansion is proceeding as planned," he said, refilling his glass from my tray without acknowledging my existence. "We'll begin phased domestic downsizing next quarter. The union won't see it coming until it's too late." "What about the pension obligations?" another man asked. Mr. Preston laughed. "We've restructured the holding company. When the layoffs come, the pension fund will mysteriously find itself underfunded. Very unfortunate timing." They chuckled together. These men who were plotting the devastation of my father's livelihood, my town's foundation, as casually as they discussed the weather. I stood frozen, champagne tray trembling slightly in my hands, as they mapped out the calculated destruction of hundreds of families' futures. 3 months later, the first layoffs began. By the following year, the mill had reduced its workforce by 60%. My father, despite 18 years of service, was among those cut. The promised severance packages were slashed. The pension fund indeed proved mysteriously inadequate, and Mr. Preston received a substantial bonus for successful operational restructuring. I watched my father's spirit crumble along with his identity. My mother took on additional cleaning jobs, working herself to exhaustion 6 days a week. I juggled school with part-time work at the local diner, serving the very executives who had orchestrated the economic devastation around us. The experience crystallized something in me. Not just anger at the injustice, but a cold, clear understanding of power. Who had it, how they used it, and how invisible the powerless became to those who held it. I swore then that I would never be invisible again, that I would build something no one could casually destroy over champagne. I worked my way through community college, then won a scholarship to the University of Michigan. My business professors found my intensity unnerving, my questions too pointed, my projects too ambitious. One advisor suggested I set more realistic goals appropriate for someone of your background. Instead, I doubled down. MBA applications to top programs, night jobs to fund test prep and application fees, endless hours studying financial systems, corporate structures, international markets, anything that might give me an edge. Harvard Business School's acceptance letter arrived the same week my father took a job as a night janitor at the local hospital, cleaning floors in the same town where he'd once been a respected foreman. The contrast was not lost on me. At Harvard, I encountered a more polished version of the Preston family's casual entitlement. Classmates from privileged backgrounds who viewed my scholarship status as a curiosity at best, a dilution of standards at worst. Professors who seemed surprised when the girl from Michigan outperformed their expectations. Study groups that initially excluded me, then grudgingly acknowledged my contributions while attributing them to obsessive overcompensation. I graduated with honors and multiple job offers, but none aligned with my true ambition. I didn't want to climb someone else's corporate ladder. I wanted to build my own. With my meager savings, maxed-out credit cards, and small loans from 2 professors who had finally recognized my potential, I founded Artemis International. The early years were brutal. Potential clients who wouldn't take meetings with a female founder. Investors who asked if there was a man on the team they could speak with. Banks that required co-signers despite my impeccable business plan. I endured it all with the same cold clarity I developed watching the mill's calculated destruction. Observing, documenting, remembering, and planning for the day when such dismissal would become a strategic advantage. Artemis International's first major success came from identifying an opportunity others had missed, a manufacturing technology that reduced costs while improving working conditions. I structured deals that benefited both shareholders and employees, creating a model that challenged the zero-sum approach of companies like the mill that had employed my father. As Artemis grew, acquiring subsidiaries and expanding globally, maintained a deliberately low profile. R.E. Winters became known as brilliant but reclusive, communicating through proxies and video conferences with carefully controlled lighting. This wasn't just about privacy. It was strategic. I had learned from Oak Ridge that being underestimated could provide unique insights, that people revealed their true nature when they believed no one important was watching. When I met David at that Vienna charity gala 7 years ago, Artemis International was already a multinational corporation with billions in annual revenue. I was 37, exhausted from back-to-back relationships with men who seemed more interested in my wealth than in me. The experiment of introducing myself simply as Rebecca, an art consultant, began as a momentary whim, a brief vacation from being R.E. Winters. David's apparent interest in me, just me, without the trappings of corporate power, had been intoxicating. For the first time in years, I felt seen as a person rather than a balance sheet. Our courtship was a respite from the relentless pressure of running Artemis, a glimpse of a different life where I could simply be Rebecca. The decision to maintain the charade after our relationship deepened wasn't planned. It evolved organically as I discovered the pleasure of moving through the world unburdened by others' expectations or judgments about my success. David seemed to value me for myself, to enjoy my company without agenda. When he proposed after 18 months of dating, I said yes with genuine hope that I'd found someone who loved the woman, not the wealth. Only after our marriage did the subtle shifts begin. David's promotion to Meridian Global, a subsidiary I had recently acquired through a holding company, coincided with his growing dismissiveness toward my opinions on current events, politics, and eventually, even household decisions. The man who had once listened attentively to my perspectives on art and literature began interrupting me, correcting me, then simply talking over me. The anonymous ethics complaints about Meridian's executive team arrived at precisely this turning point in our marriage. The decision to investigate personally, to maintain my cover as just a housewife while gathering evidence, merged professional necessity with personal reckoning. I needed to understand if the company culture reflected my husband's evolving attitude, and if so, how deeply the problem ran. What I discovered was more troubling than I'd anticipated. Not just financial improprieties that could trigger regulatory investigations, but a systemic pattern of discrimination, particularly against women in leadership positions. The familiar dynamics I'd observed since childhood in Oak Ridge, the casual cruelty of privilege, the invisibility of the disempowered, had infected Meridian Global like a virus. And at the center of it all was David, the man I had married, transforming from the attentive partner who had valued my thoughts into someone who mockingly introduced me as just a housewife at company functions. The 3-year investigation had been necessary professionally, but devastating personally. Each recorded instance of David's contempt, each documented example of his executive team's misconduct, had driven home the painful reality: the man I loved had never truly existed. Or perhaps he had, briefly, before power revealed his fundamental character. A knock at my office door pulled me from these reflections. Elena entered with a tablet displaying real-time updates from throughout the organization. The initial response to the leadership change has been predominantly positive, she reported, particularly from mid-level management and the departments, most affected by the previous executive's discriminatory practices. I nodded, unsurprised. Toxic leadership rarely fools those directly under it, only those above who benefit from the results without witnessing the methods. Diana Davis is here for your meeting, Elena added. And David has escalated to calling board members directly. 3 have contacted me asking how to respond. I closed the photo album on my desk, setting aside the past to focus on the present. Tell the board to direct all communication through legal channels and send Ms. Davis in. It's time to start rebuilding what they tried to destroy. As Elena left to fetch Diana, I straightened my shoulders and took a deep breath. The historical context that had shaped both Artemis International and my approach to leadership wasn't just a personal journey, it was the foundation for what would come next. The painful lessons from Oak Ridge, Harvard, and my marriage had all led to this moment of reckoning and renewal. The past could not be changed, but the future was still unwritten. And today, we would begin writing it with clearer purpose and vision than ever before. Meeting with Diana Davis proved both productive and illuminating. The brilliant strategist David had sidelined displayed none of the uncertainty he had described in his drunken assessments. Instead, she presented a comprehensive vision for the Singapore project that addressed contingencies I hadn't even considered. By the end of our hour together, I had not only reinstated her as project lead, but also promoted her to the interim executive committee overseeing Meridian's transition. I don't understand, she said as our meeting concluded. How did you know about my original proposal? About what happened? I smiled, recognizing the careful way she was probing for information without appearing too curious about the morning's dramatic events. Rumors were already circulating throughout the building. I make it my business to know when talent is being wasted, Ms. Davis, especially when that talent provides solutions to problems others haven't even identified yet. She studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. The company-wide email mentioned inappropriate behavior by the former executive team. Systematic gender discrimination was one of several issues, I confirmed. And yes, your reassignment was part of that pattern. The records show your proposal was superior in every metric, yet it was reassigned to Johnson with no legitimate business justification. Diana's professional composure cracked slightly. I knew it. I just couldn't prove it. That's often the challenge with workplace discrimination, I acknowledged. Fortunately, in this case, we had unusual access to candid discussions among the leadership team. Curiosity finally overcame professional reserve. The rumors say you're David Morrison's wife, that you were secretly running Artemis all along while he thought you were just a... She stopped herself. Just a housewife? I finished for her. Yes, that's essentially accurate, though considerably simplified. Her eyes widened. So all those company events where you were just quietly in the background, serving drinks, making small talk with the other spouses. I was observing, listening, documenting. I leaned forward slightly. The powerful rarely filter themselves around those they consider irrelevant, Ms. Davis. It's both their weakness and our opportunity. As Diana left my office with her new executive access badge, I turned my attention to the mountain of transition details requiring immediate decisions. The rhythms of corporate crisis management were familiar. I had built Artemis International through multiple acquisitions, restructurings, and strategic pivots. The difference now was that I was managing this transition publicly, as myself, without the elaborate mechanisms of proxies and carefully managed video appearances. Elena entered with fresh coffee and another update. Security reports David has made 3 attempts to re-enter the building using his old credentials. He's currently at the Capitol Grill downtown with Victor Harrington. Based on their body language, the conversation appears heated. I nodded, unsurprised. The alliance between David and Victor had always been transactional, mutual advancement through mutual protection. With their careers simultaneously imploding, that alliance would fracture under pressure. Have we received any legal communication from any of them yet? Nothing formal? Elena replied. Though David has apparently contacted Garrison and Wentworth about representation. I allowed myself a small smile. Garrison and Wentworth was indeed a prestigious firm, one that handled significant business for Artemis International's European operations. The conflict check would prevent them from taking David's case, another dead end he would discover too late. And the penthouse? I asked. All security protocols updated as instructed. David's access has been restricted to a 4-hour window tomorrow between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. to collect additional personal belongings, with security present throughout. I nodded, satisfied with the arrangements. The penthouse itself meant little. To me, it was just one of several properties I maintained in different cities. But the symbolism of controlling access to what David had considered our home, though he had contributed nothing to its purchase or maintenance, would reinforce the new power dynamic. What about the media inquiries? I asked, scanning the flagged emails in my inbox. Increasing exponentially, Elena confirmed. The business press is particularly interested in your dual identity and the termination of Meridian's entire executive team. The Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and Bloomberg have all requested exclusive interviews. Decline all interview requests for now, I instructed. Issue the prepared statement emphasizing corporate governance concerns and our commitment to rebuilding a more inclusive culture at Meridian. Keep the focus on the future, not the past. As Elena left to implement these directives, I turned to the electronic evidence database we had compiled over the past 3 years. The files were organized chronologically, documenting the evolution of Meridian's toxic culture under David's leadership. What had begun as occasional sexist comments and subtle undermining of female colleagues had progressed to systematic discrimination, financial manipulation, and eventually, outright corporate espionage. The Singapore project was just one example of many. Diana Davis, after developing the comprehensive expansion strategy that would have secured Meridian's position in the Asian market, had been abruptly removed as project lead. David had claimed to the board that she lacked the necessary gravitas for high-level negotiations, a thinly veiled reference to her gender that had gone unchallenged by his fellow executives. My documentation included not just David's dismissive comments about Diana during our dinner parties, but also the subsequent performance metrics showing the project's decline under Johnson's leadership. The contrast between Diana's original proposal and Johnson's watered-down implementation was stark, representing millions in lost opportunity costs and market share. This pattern repeated across departments and initiatives throughout Meridian Global. Women and minorities consistently received lower performance ratings despite objective metrics showing superior results. Promotions went to those in David's inner circle regardless of qualifications. Compensation packages reflected not merit, but proximity to power. All of it meticulously captured in my database. Recordings from dinner parties and corporate events, forwarded emails, financial analyses showing the impact of these decisions, and testimony from employees who had left the company citing the toxic environment. Building this evidence hadn't been simple. Each piece required careful collection and verification without revealing my true identity or purpose. The operation had been architectural in its complexity, requiring multiple layers of security and discretion. The most challenging aspect had been maintaining the psychological compartmentalization necessary to live as Rebecca, while simultaneously running Artemis International. Each morning involved a calculated transformation, from corporate strategist to seemingly simple housewife, changing not just clothes and makeup, but body language, vocabulary, and thought patterns. I had maintained a secure office in a separate building registered to one of Artemis's shell companies, where I spent hours during David's business trips and my supposed volunteer work and yoga classes. There, I would conduct video conferences with international divisions, review quarterly projections, and direct Artemis's global strategy, all while David believed I was organizing charity fundraisers or attending cooking classes. The technological infrastructure supporting this dual identity was equally elaborate. Secure servers housed in Switzerland contained the growing evidence database, accessible only through encrypted connections and biometric authentication. Communication with Elena and my small circle of trusted executives utilized rotating encryption protocols that would have impressed government intelligence agencies. Physical evidence, documents, recordings, notes, was stored in a secure vault, within my private home office, hidden behind a false wall that David, in his certainty about his wife's simplicity, never thought to look for or question. Every dinner party at our home was an intelligence-gathering operation disguised as social entertainment. The expensive scotch I served loosened inhibitions and encouraged David and his colleagues to speak freely about their business strategies, office politics, and personal views, all captured by discrete recording devices disguised as decorative objects throughout our living spaces. The thing about women in tech, Victor had once pontificated over his third glass of Macallan 25, is that they just don't have the killer instinct. Take Matthews in product development. Technically skilled, I'll grant you, but she hesitates. When real money's on the line. Exactly, David had agreed, refilling glasses while I prepared dessert in the kitchen. That's why I moved the Thompson account to Erickson's team. Matthews had the technical specs right, but Erickson knows how to close. What neither realized was that Matthews in product development was Emily Matthews, one of Artemis International's most promising innovations leaders, temporarily assigned to Meridian to evaluate their product pipeline. Her hesitation had been her ethical concerns about cutting regulatory corners, concerns that proved prescient when the hasty launch overseen by Erickson resulted in costly compliance issues 6 months later. All of this, the observation, the documentation, the strategic patience, had been building toward the moment of revelation that had finally arrived this morning. Yet the preparation extended beyond merely gathering evidence of misconduct. I had simultaneously been developing the framework for Meridian's rehabilitation post-David. This parallel planning included identifying high-potential employees like Diana Davis, who had been systematically sidelined, developing performance improvement plans for departments suffering under toxic leadership, creating communication strategies for the inevitable transition period, establishing enhanced ethics reporting mechanisms to prevent similar problems in the future, designing comprehensive training programs to address unconscious bias and promote inclusive leadership. The board had only seen the evidence of misconduct this morning, not yet the full scope of the reconstruction plan I had developed. That would come tomorrow, when the initial shock had settled and the focus could shift from accountability to rebuilding. A notification on my secure phone interrupted these reflections. Facial recognition at the penthouse security system had detected David attempting to override the updated access protocols. The camera showed him becoming increasingly agitated as his credentials were repeatedly rejected, eventually slamming his fist against the biometric scanner in frustration. I watched dispassionately, recognizing the pattern I'd observed countless times during our marriage. David's response to obstacles always followed the same progression: disbelief, anger, attempted manipulation, and finally, when all else failed, reluctant acceptance. He was currently in the anger phase, his sense of entitlement colliding with the new reality I had engineered. Another notification followed. David was now calling the building manager, likely attempting to leverage his status to gain access. The manager, of course, reported directly to an Artemis International subsidiary that managed the luxury property. His attempts would be politely but firmly rebuffed, another dead end in his rapidly narrowing options. This predictable sequence of reactions had been accounted for in my planning. David's psychological profile, his pride, his need for control, his assumption of privilege, had made his responses to each phase of this operation foreseeable. I had prepared countermeasures for every likely scenario, from legal challenges to attempted character assassination to financial retaliation. What David and his colleagues failed to understand was that their downfall hadn't begun this morning. It had begun 3 years ago, with 1,000 small moments of disrespect and dismissal. Each time they had mocked just a housewife, each time they had spoken freely about their misconduct in my presence, each time they had treated me as invisible or inconsequential, they had added another piece to the evidence that would eventually end their careers. The preparation hadn't just been technical or strategic, it had been psychological as well. Living as Rebecca while maintaining my identity as R.E. Winters had required extraordinary compartmentalization. I had needed to respond authentically to humiliation and disrespect without revealing my true feelings or intentions. I had to appear genuinely hurt by David's casual cruelty while simultaneously documenting it for future accountability. This psychological discipline had perhaps been the most challenging aspect of the entire operation. There were moments, particularly in the final year as David's behavior worsened, when maintaining the facade became nearly unbearable. When his mockery cut too close to memories of real dismissal and discrimination I had faced throughout my career. When the gap between who I truly was and who I pretended to be stretched my emotional resources to their limits. Yet this disciplined preparation, this willingness to endure temporary humiliation in service of ultimate justice, had made today's revelation all the more powerful. The executive's shock this morning hadn't merely been about discovering my true identity, it had been the sudden, devastating realization that their entire reality had been constructed on false assumptions about power, gender, and worth. Elena. Returned with updates from the department heads' meetings. The transition is proceeding as planned. Initial uncertainty has given way to cautious optimism, particularly among the mid-level managers who were most affected by the previous leadership's practices. I nodded, pleased, but not surprised. Toxic leadership rarely fools those directly beneath it, only those above who benefit from results without witnessing methods. And Diana Davis has already assembled her team for the Singapore project, Elena continued. She's requesting access to the original proposal documents that were archived when the project was reassigned. Grant her full access, I instructed. and schedule a call with our Singapore office for tomorrow morning. I want to personally inform them of the leadership change and our renewed commitment to the original vision." As Elena left to implement these directions, I turned again to the window, watching the city lights begin to emerge as dusk approached. Somewhere out there, David was discovering how thoroughly his world had been dismantled. Access denied, accounts frozen, reputation damaged, marriage ended. Yet my focus had already shifted from dismantling to rebuilding. The painstaking preparation hadn't been merely for destruction, but for creation. Creating a company culture where talent like Diana Davis could flourish, where ethical concerns weren't dismissed as hesitation, where leadership meant service rather than entitlement. The hidden work, the behind-the-scenes preparation that had consumed 3 years of my life, was finally bearing fruit. Not just in the accountability for past wrongs, but in the foundation for future growth. And that, ultimately, had been the purpose all along. The first week following the revelation unfolded with the controlled chaos I had anticipated. Each day brought new developments, challenges, and the inevitable aftershocks of removing an entire executive team simultaneously. I had maintained residence at my downtown apartment, a space David never knew existed, while managing both Meridian's transition and the personal fallout from our imploding marriage. Elena entered my office with the morning briefing, her tablet loaded with overnight updates. David's attorney finally made contact. Not Garrison and Wentworth, obviously. He's retained Matthews and Sinclair instead. I nodded, unsurprised. Matthews and Sinclair was a respectable firm, though not in the top tier David would have preferred. They specialized in high-profile divorces and corporate disputes, a reasonable choice given his circumstances. Their initial communication is interesting, Elena continued, forwarding the document to my secure tablet. I skimmed the legal letter, noting the carefully calibrated combination of threats and overtures. David was demanding restoration of his personal accounts, which had been frozen pending financial review, immediate access to the penthouse, and a substantial good faith payment to tide him over during negotiations. In exchange, he offered vague assurances of discretion regarding my deceptive practices and psychological manipulation during our marriage. The implicit threat was clear: cooperate or face a public smear campaign. Predictable, I murmured, setting the tablet aside. Have legal prepare the standard response. No access to accounts under investigation for potential financial improprieties. Limited supervised access to the penthouse is already arranged. No financial disbursements outside the legal process. They're requesting a meeting, Elena noted. David and his attorneys want to discuss terms in person. I considered this briefly. A face-to-face meeting would serve no practical purpose at this stage, but David's request wasn't surprising. He had always relied heavily on his personal charm and intimidation tactics in difficult negotiations, tools that worked effectively in person but lost potency through legal intermediaries. Decline for now, I decided. All communication should remain through proper channels until the financial investigation is complete. Elena made a note, then continued with the morning's updates. The interim executive team is performing well. Diana Davis's Singapore project is back on track. Employee morale surveys show significant improvement across departments previously under direct oversight of David's team. This was promising, but expected. Removing toxic leadership almost always produced an immediate boost in morale and productivity, though sustaining that improvement would require structural changes and cultural reinforcement. And externally? I asked. Mixed, Elena admitted. The business press is predominantly focused on the corporate governance angle. The undercover boss narrative is proving quite popular. Investment analysts have responded positively to the leadership change given Meridian's recent underperformance relative to sector benchmarks. She hesitated slightly before continuing. The tabloids, however, have taken a more personal approach. David gave an interview to the National Register yesterday. She handed me a printout of the article, headlined, "Betrayed, Executive Husband Speaks Out About Wife's 3-Year Deception." The accompanying photo showed David looking appropriately somber and wounded in what appeared to be his mother's living room, the same mother who had told me at our wedding that I was lucky to have caught such an ambitious man. The article was exactly what I had expected. A carefully constructed narrative portraying David as the victim of manipulation, his only crime being too trusting of a wife who had orchestrated an elaborate corporate sting operation under the guise of marriage. He described feeling violated upon discovering that intimate conversations had been recorded, and concerned about the psychological stability of someone who could maintain such an extensive deception. He claims you married him as part of a premeditated plan to spy on Meridian Global, Elena noted, unable to keep a note of indignation from her voice. That the entire relationship was a corporate espionage operation. I set the article aside, unmoved by David's predictable attempt to reshape the narrative. The timing makes that claim rather difficult to substantiate. We began dating 3 years before Artemis acquired Meridian Global through our subsidiary. Unless he's suggesting I have precognitive abilities, the chronology doesn't support his theory. Should we issue a statement correcting the record? Elena asked. No, I replied firmly. Engaging directly with tabloid accusations only lends them credibility. Our focus remains on corporate governance and Meridian's future, not personal matters. I returned to the morning's priority list, but couldn't help noticing Elena's lingering concern. Something else? I prompted. She hesitated. There's been some escalation in David's behavior. Security reported he appeared intoxicated when attempting to access the penthouse last night. When denied entry, he became verbally abusive toward staff. There's also been unusual activity around your parents' assisted living facility in Michigan. This caught my attention. What kind of activity? Nothing directly concerning, Elena assured me quickly. Just inquiries, someone matching David's. Description asked about visitation policies and resident schedules yesterday. Given your parents' protected status in our security protocols, it triggered an alert. A cold calculation settled over me. The escalation was proceeding faster than anticipated, but along predicted lines. David, finding his first attempts at legal and public leverage insufficient, was exploring more personal pressure points. My elderly parents, my father still struggling with the health consequences of his post-mill unemployment, my mother finally enjoying retirement after decades of cleaning other people's homes, represented both an emotional vulnerability and a potential source of embarrassing background information. Increase security at the facility, I instructed. No changes to my parents' routines, but add personnel to the existing protective detail, and have legal prepare restraining order documentation if needed. Elena nodded, already typing the directives into her tablet. There's one more development you should be aware of. Victor Harrington has approached our HR department offering to provide information about improprieties under David's leadership in exchange for a settlement package. I allowed myself a small smile at this predictable betrayal. Victor turning. On David already? That didn't take long. Less than 7 days, Elena confirmed, sharing my lack of surprise. He's offering details about the Jensen acquisition irregularities and David's involvement in sidelining female executives. Have legal take his statement but make no promises, I decided. Any settlement will depend on the value and verifiability of his information, and make it clear that cooperation now doesn't guarantee immunity for his own misconduct. As Elena left to implement these directives, I turned to the window, watching the morning light illuminate the city below. The escalating tension was unfolding according to predictable psychological patterns. David had progressed from shock to denial, from anger to attempted manipulation, and was now entering a more dangerous phase of escalation. This pattern had been accounted for in my contingency planning. David's personality profile, his entitlement, his need for control, his inability to accept responsibility for failures, made his responses to loss of status and power predictable. Each countermeasure had been prepared in advance, ready to deploy as his desperation increased. My phone buzzed with a text from Diana Davis. Singapore team fully engaged with revised proposal. Projected implementation timeline improved by 30% with original strategy restored. Thank you for the opportunity. This was the real victory, not David's downfall, but the liberation of talent like Diana's from the artificial constraints imposed by biased leadership. Each such success reinforced the necessity and righteousness of the actions I had taken, however extreme they might appear to outsiders. By midday, Elena returned with updates from legal and security. Restraining order documentation is prepared, if needed. Security confirms additional personnel are in place at your parents' facility. And there's been another development with David. She handed me her tablet displaying security footage from the Meridian Global lobby. The timestamp showed 10:37 a.m., less than an hour ago. David, visibly agitated and slightly disheveled, was attempting to bypass security using an expired executive badge. When that failed, he demanded to see my wife, Ms. Winters. The security team, following established protocols, politely but firmly denied him access. He left this with the front desk, Elena said, placing a sealed envelope on my desk. Security has cleared it. No harmful substances or devices. The envelope contained a handwritten letter, unusual in this digital age, but very much in character, for David when attempting to convey sincerity. His handwriting showed signs of stress, harder pressure, slightly erratic spacing, as he vacillated between threats and appeals to our real connection despite everything. "I know you, Rebecca, or whatever you're calling yourself now," he had written. 3 years of marriage can't be faked entirely. There were moments, real moments between us. You know it as well as I do. This corporate war doesn't have to destroy everything. I'm willing to discuss reasonable terms if you'll meet with me directly instead of hiding behind lawyers. The letter continued with a mixture of veiled threats and emotional appeals, concluding with, "You have until Friday to agree to a private meeting. After that, I can't guarantee discretion regarding certain aspects of your past and our relationship. That you might prefer remain private." I placed the letter in our evidence file, unmoved by its transparent manipulation tactics. David's attempt to leverage our marriage against me was both predictable and futile. The real moments he referenced had indeed existed, primarily in the early days before his promotion, but they offered him no strategic advantage now. "No response necessary," I told Elena. "But update security protocols. David should not be permitted in any Artemis International or Meridian Global facility under any circumstances." "Already implemented," she confirmed. "There's one more thing. You should see." She pulled up a social media feed on her tablet. David has been connecting with former Meridian employees who left under controversial circumstances, particularly those who filed complaints that were dismissed under his leadership. The social media evidence showed David systematically reaching out to former employees who had conflict with me or Artemis in the past, apparently searching for damaging information or potential allies in his campaign against me. Most had ignored his overtures, but a few had engaged, expressing sympathy for his shocking situation. Monitor but don't intervene, I decided. The majority of those employees left precisely because of the toxic culture David and his team created. His attempts to recruit them against me will likely backfire once they understand the full context. By late afternoon, the situation had escalated further. Elena returned from a meeting with the legal team, her usually composed expression showing concern. "David made an unscheduled appearance at the board member luncheon," she reported. "He somehow discovered their quarterly social gathering at the GI Metropolitan Club and approached several members directly. Security removed him, but not before he distributed what he's calling evidence of corporate espionage and illegal surveillance to everyone present." "What exactly did he share?" I asked, already anticipating the answer. "Photos of recording devices. From your home, screenshots of security logs showing your dual identities, and personal calendar entries suggesting premeditation in your relationship. I nodded, having expected this move eventually, though perhaps not so soon. And the board's reaction? Walter Kingsley called immediately, Elena said. He described the encounter as desperate and inappropriate, and reaffirmed the board's full confidence in your leadership. The other members have similarly reached out to express support, though Charlotte Reeves mentioned concerns about potential media fallout if David continues his public campaign. The escalation was accelerating more rapidly than projected, but still following predictable patterns. David, finding himself blocked at every turn, legally, financially, and professionally, was becoming increasingly desperate and erratic. The risk of truly damaging behavior was growing proportionally. Implement the Phase 2 security protocols, I instructed. Full monitoring of David's public communications and movements. Alert all relevant parties about potential contact or disinformation, and schedule a board briefing for tomorrow morning to address any lingering concerns directly. As darkness fell outside my office windows, I reviewed the day's developments with the cold clarity that had guided me through building Artemis International. The escalating tension with David was unfortunate, but necessary, a predictable stage in the dismantling of toxic leadership and the reconstruction of something better. My secure phone buzzed with an alert from our monitoring system. David had just appeared on an evening business news program, his first mainstream media appearance since the termination. Seated across from a sympathetic interviewer, he looked appropriately somber in a suit I recognized, one I had purchased for him last Christmas. "It's not just about losing my job," he was saying, his voice carefully modulated to convey wounded dignity. "It's about discovering that your entire marriage was potentially fraudulent, that intimate conversations in your own home were being recorded without consent, that the person you shared your life with was playing a role the entire time." The interviewer nodded with practiced concern. "And you had no indication of your wife's true identity throughout your 3-year marriage?" David shook his head sadly. "Rebecca was convincing. Looking back, there were moments that make more sense now. Unexplained absences, unusual questions about my work, a private room in our home that she claimed was for her art projects. But when you trust someone completely, you don't look for deception." The irony was almost painful. David, who had systematically deceived me about his true character, who had presented himself as supportive and egalitarian while harboring deeply regressive views about women's capabilities, was now positioning himself as the victim of deception. I switched off the interview, having seen enough to understand his strategy. David was attempting to shift focus from his professional misconduct to our personal relationship, reframing the narrative as a marriage betrayal rather than corporate malfeasance. It was a calculated attempt to generate public sympathy and pressure me into a more favorable settlement. The tension would continue to escalate in the coming days. David, finding each conventional avenue blocked, would become increasingly unpredictable. The carefully constructed facade of professional polish would erode further, potentially revealing the raw entitlement and rage beneath. Yet even this escalation had been anticipated in my planning. Each contingency had been mapped, each potential attack vector secured. The tension, however uncomfortable, was a necessary stage in the process of accountability and transformation. I closed the security report and turned back to the transition plans for Meridian Global. The company's future, not David's desperate attempts to salvage his reputation, remained my priority. The escalation would run its course, but it would not derail the larger mission of rebuilding what his leadership had damaged. As night settled over the city, I reviewed Diana Davis's revised Singapore proposals with a sense of calm purpose. The growing storm of David's escalating behavior would break eventually, but what remained afterward, a transformed organization where talent like Diana's could flourish unimpeded, would be worth the temporary turbulence. 2 weeks after the revelation, A semblance of new normalcy had begun to emerge. Meridian Global's operations had stabilized under interim leadership, with productivity metrics already showing improvement in departments previously managed by David's team. The media cycle had started to move on from the sensational aspects of the story, returning focus to business fundamentals. Artemis International's stock price had fully recovered from its initial dip and was now trending upward as market analysts recognized the long-term benefits of improved governance. I had settled into a more public version of the leadership role I'd always held, no longer hiding behind proxies and controlled video appearances. The freedom of operating openly as R.E. Winters again, after 3 years of compartmentalization, brought an unexpected sense of relief, like finally removing a restricting garment worn too long. The board meeting that morning had been productive, with unanimous approval of my restructuring plan for Meridian Global. Walter Kingsley had made a point of expressing the board's complete confidence in my leadership, a subtle but clear message that David's attempts to undermine my position had failed completely. The transition team's report exceeds our expectations, Charlotte Reeves had noted, reviewing the first 2 weeks' performance metrics. Particularly impressive is the rapid improvement in departments previously showing high turnover under the former management. I had just returned to my office from this successful meeting when Elena entered with her characteristic efficiency, though something in her expression immediately alerted me that the relative calm of recent days was about to end. "There's been an incident," she said without preamble, placing her tablet on my desk. "David appears to have accessed sensitive company information through unauthorized means." The security alert displayed on her tablet showed unusual access patterns to Meridian's archived server data, specifically, files related to the company's most sensitive ongoing negotiations and proprietary product development. The access had been traced to an external IP address associated with a coffee shop near David's mother's home. "How is this possible?" I asked, immediately reviewing the technical details. "His credentials were revoked the moment he was terminated. He used Jennifer Matthews's login credentials," Elena explained. "According to preliminary investigation, he approached her claiming he needed access to retrieve personal files before legal proceedings froze his accounts completely. She believed she was helping him access personal photos and contacts. Jennifer Matthews, David's former executive assistant, a loyal employee who had worked with him for years before his promotion. Someone who might still feel personal loyalty to him despite his termination, who might believe his version of events over the official corporate narrative." "What specific files did he access?" I asked, already calculating potential damage. "Primarily, the Singapore project documents, the original proposal, financial projections, and strategic partnership agreements. Also, several files related to the Thompson account and the Jensen acquisition." I nodded, seeing the pattern immediately. These weren't random selections. David was strategically targeting information that could either damage Meridian Global if leaked to competitors or provide leverage in his increasingly desperate attempts to negotiate a settlement. "Security has already locked Matthews's credentials and initiated containment protocols," Elena continued. "It is tracing all access and downloads. But there's more." She swiped to another screen showing a financial alert. David attempted to transfer funds from one of the Artemis subsidiary accounts to an offshore entity created 3 days ago. The transaction was flagged and blocked by our security systems, but the attempt itself indicates escalation beyond information gathering. This was indeed a significant escalation, from public pressure tactics and reputation management to active attempts at corporate espionage and financial theft. The progression was concerning but not entirely unexpected. As each conventional avenue closed to him, David's desperation was driving him toward increasingly risky and potentially illegal actions. "Has legal been notified?" I asked. "Yes. They're preparing documentation for potential criminal charges related to unauthorized access and attempted financial fraud. However, they've advised caution regarding immediate action." I understood the hesitation. Criminal charges would elevate this from a corporate governance matter to a public legal battle, potentially reviving media interest just as the story was fading from the news cycle. It would also irrevocably transform David from former executive to criminal defendant, a line that, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. "There's one more development," Elena said, her expression grave. "David has contacted several of our major clients directly, including the Thompson account and Singapore partners. He's claiming to have evidence of improper surveillance and corporate governance violations that could impact pending deals. This was the most serious threat yet, an attempt to destabilize Artemis's client relationships and damage the company's market position. It represented a fundamental shift in David's approach, from seeking personal vindication to actively trying to harm the company that had terminated him. "Show me the client communications," I requested. Elena brought up the relevant messages, emails, David had sent to key contacts at our most important accounts. The language was carefully calibrated, expressing reluctant concern about troubling practices he had recently discovered that could potentially expose clients to regulatory scrutiny. He offered to share this supposed evidence in private conversations, positioning himself as a whistleblower rather than a disgruntled former executive. "Client responses?" I asked, already formulating our countermeasures. "Mixed," Elena reported. "Thompson has ignored his outreach completely. 2 Singapore partners have requested clarification from our team. The Jensen representatives have asked for an urgent call to discuss his allegations." I nodded, processing this information with the same strategic clarity that had built Artemis International. "Schedule calls with all contacted clients immediately. Transparency is our best defense. Provide them with the appropriate context regarding David's termination and current legal situation. No defensiveness, just facts." "Already arranged," Elena confirmed. "First call in 30 minutes with the Singapore team." "Perfect. And Jennifer Matthews?" "Security has isolated her systems and HR has placed her on administrative leave pending investigation. Initial questioning suggests she genuinely believed she was helping David retrieve personal files, not company documents." I considered this. Matthews's poor judgment had created a serious security breach, but her intent appeared misguided rather than malicious. The appropriate response would need to balance accountability with proportionality. "Have HR schedule a formal review for Matthews next week after we've completed the full security assessment. In the meantime, all executives should be reminded about credential sharing protocols and potential manipulation tactics from former employees." As Elena left to implement these directives, my secure line rang. Walter Kingsley, the board chairman. "I've just been contacted by David Morrison," he said without preamble when I answered. "He's threatening to take information about supposed corporate governance violations at Artemis to the SEC if we don't agree to reinstate him in some capacity." This was the precipitating incident I had been anticipating, the moment when David's increasing desperation drove him to cross the line from annoying to truly dangerous. His attempts to leverage stolen information against the company represented a fundamental breach that required decisive response. "What specific allegations is he making?" I asked, my voice calm despite the escalation. "Vague references to improper surveillance, conflicts of interest in the Meridian acquisition, and supposed financial irregularities he claims to have documentation for. Nothing concrete, but delivered with enough confidence to be concerning if there's any substance behind it." "There isn't," I assured him. "Everything I've done, while unconventional, has been legally reviewed at each step. The surveillance was of misconduct occurring in my own home. The acquisition followed all regulatory requirements with appropriate recusals, and our financials have been independently audited quarterly." "I assumed as much," Kingsley replied, "but the board needs to be prepared for any potential investigation if he actually files a complaint. False allegations can still create significant disruption." "Understood. I'll have legal prepare a comprehensive briefing for the board outlining our compliance measures and documentation. In the meantime, what was your response to David's approach?" I informed him that any legitimate concerns should be directed through proper channels, and that attempted coercion of board members would only worsen his legal position. He didn't take the rejection well. I could imagine. David's sense of entitlement had always been his blind spot, the inability to conceive that his demands might be refused, that his charm might not overcome principled opposition. "There's something else," Kingsley continued, his tone shifting slightly. "He mentioned having documentation related to your personal history. Something about your father's involvement in union activities at a mill in Michigan? He implied there might be legal issues from that period that could prove embarrassing if made public." I closed my eyes briefly, a rare moment of genuine emotion breaking through my professional composure. My father's desperate attempts to save his co-workers' livelihoods after the mill's calculated destruction, the petition drives, the community, organizing, the ultimately failed lawsuit against the corporate raiders who had dismantled their economic foundation, none of it illegal, all of it potentially uncomfortable for someone in my position if presented without context in today's polarized environment. There were no legal issues, I stated firmly. My father was a union representative who fought honorably for his co-workers when the mill was being systematically dismantled. Any documentation David might have obtained would show a working-class man standing up for his community, nothing more. I assumed it was another empty threat, Kingsley affirmed, but thought you should be aware of his attempts to leverage personal information. After concluding the call with Kingsley, I stood at my office window, contemplating the escalation pattern that was unfolding. David had progressed from denial to anger, from public relations attacks to attempted client poaching, and now to actual corporate espionage and blackmail attempts. Each failure drove him to more extreme measures. Each blocked avenue pushed him closer to truly irrevocable actions. This precipitating incident, the unauthorized access combined with explicit threats to the board, marked a crucial turning point. It transformed David from a nuisance to be managed into an active threat requiring neutralization. The time for measured response had ended. Decisive action was now necessary. Elena returned with updates on the security investigation. It has confirmed that David downloaded approximately 30 files, including all the Singapore project documentation, the confidential Thompson account proposals, and several executive compensation records. The download occurred yesterday afternoon, giving him potentially 18 hours with the information before we detected the breach. And his current location? Unknown at present. His mother's house is empty. His credit cards show no recent activity. His phone appears to be powered off. Security is monitoring known associates and potential meeting locations. I nodded, mentally shifting to full crisis management mode. Implement Protocol Thunderstorm, I instructed, referencing our comprehensive security response for serious data breaches. Full client notification under attorney privilege, accelerated security review of all systems and access points, and prepare the litigation package for immediate filing if necessary. Already in progress, Elena confirmed. Legal has also prepared a cease and desist letter regarding the client contacts, with explicit warnings about the consequences of using stolen corporate information. I turned from the window, decision made. This ends today. David has forced our hand by elevating from personal attacks to actions that threaten the company itself. Schedule an emergency board call for 2 p.m. to authorize the full legal response. And contact law enforcement about the unauthorized access and attempted financial fraud. Elena nodded, her expression showing approval of the decisive approach. Do you believe he'll actually attempt to contact regulatory authorities with his allegations? Possibly, I acknowledged. But any investigation would quickly reveal the baselessness of his claims. More concerning is the potential damage to client relationships and market confidence in the meantime. As Elena left to implement the emergency protocols, I reviewed our contingency plans with renewed focus. The precipitating incident had clarified the situation. David had chosen mutually assured destruction over acceptance of his new reality. The appropriate response was no longer measured containment, but swift and complete neutralization of the threat he posed. My secure phone buzzed with an urgent message from Diana Davis. David Morrison just contacted me directly, offering evidence that my project reassignment was part of a larger pattern of manipulation by upper management, seeking guidance on response. I replied immediately, "Thank you for the alert. Please do not engage. Forward any communication to legal immediately. Security team has been notified." This direct approach to Diana confirmed my assessment. David was growing truly desperate, reaching out to current employees in attempts to sow discord and gather allies. The precipitating incident was expanding beyond the initial data breach to a multi-pronged attack on the company's stability. By early afternoon, the situation had crystallized further. Security reported that David had been seen meeting with a known competitor's executive at an out-of-the-way restaurant. IT confirmed that specific files related to our proprietary technology had been among those downloaded. And most concerningly, our monitoring systems detected draft emails to financial journalists containing partial documents from the downloaded files, carefully selected to suggest improprieties without providing full context. The precipitating incident had evolved from potential threat to active corporate crisis. The board call would now need to address not just legal response, but comprehensive crisis management across multiple fronts: client relationships, market perception, employee morale, and potential regulatory inquiry. As I prepared for this critical meeting, I reflected on the irony of the situation. David's actions, driven by wounded pride and desperation, were now providing precisely the justification needed for the most severe consequences. His attempts to force a more favorable resolution were instead ensuring the complete destruction of any remaining professional reputation or future prospects.